Hey guys, Waldock Studios here. Today we're going to do something a little bit different. Um, Digital Foundry came out with this video not too long ago, and it talks about are the current generation graphics a bit of a letdown? Um, I would say yes, right? And I know many of you out there would say yes. And some of you are technical and some of you are not. And that's cool. Everybody has different specialities, everybody has different skill sets. We're all out in the world doing our own thing. But a lot of us are gamers, and gamers know at least a little bit about graphical settings, especially if they're PC gamers. The same may not be true for console gamers, but consoles have evolved a bit to where at least you have performance and high quality mode, and to some degree, consoles have anti-aliasing settings that are kind of like leaking into your configuration. So console gamers are becoming more and more aware of things. Now, this video is going to go through and it's going to try to explain the state of the current generation. Now, a little bit of a background on me. I started modding games back in the Quake and Unreal days, like very, very early on. I'm a programmer. I'm a software engineer. I've been in, either application development or game development of some type for over 2 decades now. I've been working within Unreal Engine for 20 years at least. And I also have experience in other engines. So I know rendering pipelines. I know it. I know them well. I know the difference between forward and deferred rendering pipelines. I know the difference between a static or baked scene and movable lights and dynamic lights. And I'm going to let this video play, and then I'm going to stop it at segments, and we're going to talk about how some of this is just rhetoric and utter BS. So, yeah.
Quite often in my YouTube recommended feed, I see videos pop up with title like issues with modern game graphics or insert franchise graphics getting worse. What are your thoughts on this phenomenon? Feels like an especially strong feeling this generation that games don't look better than they did last gen, which is wild considering the leap in compute. But I certainly do feel underwhelmed by the performance or visuals of games this generation often as well. PS5's GPU is far beyond the PS4's, but how often do games look that much better? What do you reckon about this, John? I mean, the phenomenon of this particular type of video is gaining traction, that's for sure.
For sure.
Now, I'm going to pause it right here, and I'm going to agree with the person that just said this. Everything that they just said is true. And before they try to give you the explanation of why this is, I'm going to tell you why this is. This is because we went from 1080p gaming to basically engines that were targeted at their core platform. So all of the engines at the time were developed and targeted to do statically lit or dynamically lit. This whole ray tracing BS about like all of the modern engines are made to do dynamic scenes, so like you can have a day-night cycle and things aren't statically lit, and like somehow or another that technology is just brand new. It's all a load of BS. We were doing dynamic scenes and dynamic day-night cycles back in forward rendering, all the way back in Unreal Engine 3 and Sam Fisher. The Forest in the older Unity engine had day-night cycles. Skyrim, Red Dead, Grand Theft Auto, like the list goes on and on. Conan Exiles. This whole notion of like we needed UE5 and Lumen and ray tracing for dynamic scenes is BS. We've had global illumination and other engines for some time now. The truth is 99.9% of your games are either going to be the newer version of Unity or the newer version of Unreal in this generation. And studios have been handed a paintbrush that paints poorly, and they've been forced to redesign the brush to hit a target platform they weren't intended to hit. I mean, that is plain and simple, the end of the day, the truth. We focused on DLSS FSR and upscaling technologies because these engines were not optimal at the native resolution that these consoles could run. And as a result, we have all of this performance issues. We have upscaling. Really, it should be called downscaling because that's what you're doing. You're lowering the target resolution of the actual game to something like 720p or 480p, and then you're stretching it across the screen, and you're using AI to try to like give you a better image quality. And as a result, most of our modern games, if you go back and you play ports of older games like Batman, Arkham, or something like that that doesn't have this upscaling technology hammered into the engine itself, you'll notice that those scenes and that screen resolution is a lot sharper, even on modern day consoles. Or if you go compare PS4 to PS5, it doesn't look like a muddy, blurred, smeared mess. But I'm going to let these guys talk real quick.
And there is kind of like, what can we say? I think from my perspective, developers are looking to innovate and improve graphics in ways that are quite extraordinary, but beyond the technical leap of the hardware that's been delivered to them. And the result of that is that you get this improvement to visuals, but it does come with a cost, which I think is maybe what's causing this stuff. But I'm curious what you think about this.
Correct. And I think it's a multi-pronged approach. And first, I would say that we are in sort of a state of growth in terms of graphics technology, and this is a state of growth that we've been in many times before, such as when 3D was first introduced to the world. It was very rough early on, but it was a necessary, difficult step to get there. During the PS360 generation, that was also a very difficult time. That was when we saw the rise of modern programmable pixel shaders, vertex shaders, and a lot of other modern techniques.
I would argue that the 360 was one of the easiest consoles to develop for. It's the reason why the PlayStation 3, and I've owned both consoles, took so long to catch back up, is because the 360 was actually designed more closely to a PC architecture. Granted, it had a different CPU, but the development kit at the time made the 360 very easy to program for. And I would say the later Nintendo's consoles followed that pattern as well, and then later the PS4 jumped on the bandwagon. There was nothing difficult in that era. Unreal Engine 3 and Unreal Engine 4 made some bangers back in those days. Unreal Engine 3 was supported all the way up through the PS4's life cycle, and developers were still choosing it over UE4 due to a multitude of different reasons, but the rendering pipeline being one of them. The G buffer and deferred rendering and lighting becoming cheaper for multitude of dynamic lights. Now, remember, you got to go all the way back to that change to really understand where dynamic lighting came into the picture. Most games in the UE3 era were all forward rendered, and they didn't even have forward plus. So like dynamic lighting even existed back then, but it was more expensive to have a lot of lights in the scene.
Real-time shadow maps everywhere, real-time lighting, but in many ways it could be argued it looked worse than the generation that came before it. Now I think we're facing a multitude of problems that are all kind of coalescing together to create sort of something that I can see someone perceiving as a step back. First of all, you look back to say, one example that always springs to mind is something like Uncharted 4. Especially,
beautiful game. He's going to argue that Uncharted is a static game. No one's forcing these modern day games to be dynamically lit, but I would argue that Uncharted is one of the most dynamic games that you'll ever play as far as like interactions and destructibles and objects getting knocked over or whatever. But yes, he is correct in the sense that the lighting itself is done with stationary lights. So it's shadow casting lights, but you don't have full-blown day-night cycles in a lot of these scenes, and it's a lot of interiors, and they did a lot of tricks with lighting to get the quality where it is. Now, also, I want to say I don't have anything against these guys. It's just they are making excuses for the state of the industry where people have eyeballs, and they've basically said, if you could do this back then, how come you can't do it now? And my answer to that is because the tools that were used back then have been either stripped away from studios now, like the engines just simply do not make it easy for studios to do these paths anymore. And I'm not saying that you can't statically bake lights anymore, but just through certain engine versions of UE5 as it's moved from UE4, certain pre-computed visibility, light baking tools, you've went from CPU light mask to GPU light mask. A lot of the optimization tools have been borked, or had issues along the way, and that's due to Epic's priorities being in the nanite, lumen, fully dynamic, Fortnite-like, pipeline. And a lot of the Fortnite tooling that they have is basically like, just because Fortnite does something doesn't mean that the engine, those tools are available directly to other studios. They have to develop their own tools, or cherry pick fixes, and build their own custom version of Unreal to kind of get some of those things. But I'll let him continue to talk.
I'm going to point out there's this room at the end during the epilogue to the game that is often highlighted as like, look at this is amazing, and it absolutely is. The reason it looks so amazing is because they have pre-calculated some beautiful lighting, and that combined with, of course, the artistry of the team that worked on the game, right? So this is like you're starting from this point. You have this beautiful area, beautiful room specifically. So what modern technology is trying to do, obviously, is, okay, can we reach this fidelity but actually generate it in real time? That's where we're moving towards. But why do you want to do it in real time? Well, one, that makes the actual lighting a lot more flexible in terms of what you can do with it. If it's just a single room like that, that's fine. Maybe you don't need it, but in a lot of cases it can.
Now, he talks about static lighting and everything being fixed, and then he cuts to Uncharted, and the first thing you see is a vehicle driving through a fence. Everything's dynamically casting, and even though the sun doesn't change its position, this is what's called stationary. It's got a mix of shadow maps and like in the distance it'll blend into likely a baked lighting scenario. But it doesn't really matter. This isn't forcing everything in your scene to not be interactable. The other thing he says is that, like, the industry is moving towards this thing where they want to do everything dynamically. The argument here is asinine. It's like saying, just because Lambos exist, we're going to make everyone that makes vehicles perform like a Lambo. Like that, what? Like, that, none of this is true. The reality is that the people that are making game engines and tool sets for and games that are like the quote unquote general purpose engines that all of these consoles use, Unity and Unreal, and I would even say Godot. When you start looking at indie titles, none of these indie titles are doing any of this. None of them are suffering. But if you talk about AAA game industries, they're going to be using, for the most part, Unreal Engine 5. A lot of these studios are moving over to that. And if you look at the 9th gen and the result of the 9th gen, it is a direct correlation to that tool set, that paintbrush from these artists that they are using, and the way that their hands have been forced into this. Everything has to be real time. Nothing can be pre-computed or pre-baked. It's passing the savings that these studios are having by churning through this dynamically and not having to, like, they can click a nanite checkbox. They can click a lumen checkbox. They don't have to worry about LODs anymore, HLODs anymore. Pre-baking out scenes, which baking out lights take time. You have to re-optimize something, play test it, bake the light. Re-optimize it, move it around, test it, bake the light. It's a rinse and repeat process that takes a lot of time. The truth is, they're trying to trade off the cost of development, optimization, and utilizing that time to the end user, your GPU. Like now the customer has to go out and buy a GPU that can run these things in real time so that the cost savings can be passed on to them and games can be delivered a little bit quicker, and they don't have to spend that dev cycle doing the same type of passes they used to do. I would say that we simply are just seeing the result of that outcome. And the reality is that consoles simply, they thought ninth gen consoles like the PS5 and the Xbox Series X would be there. But at this point, like the higher end 80 and 90 series GPUs are barely there on PCs. So we should have known that you couldn't do this on this generation of consoles. And they flew too far to the sun. They switched over to DirectX 12 before PSO caching was implemented into the engine already, are in a good state, should I say. And we're just seeing kind of the outcome of all of this. And you've also seen where PC gamers aren't drinking the Kool-Aid. We're not rushing out to buy the newest frame generation GPU because we're starting to realize like maybe the industry is heading in a wrong direction here. But I'll let this continue.
It's a single room like that. That's fine. Maybe you don't need it, but in a lot of cases it can be very beneficial to gameplay because it allows for a more dynamic scene, especially once you start to tie in actual moving objects, physics-based objects, other...
Yeah, he's showing videos of physics-based objects and everything in the scene. All of this could be done in previous generation consoles. Havok has been working in every Halo game since Halo's been a thing. Halo has day and night, what you call lighting scenarios, levels that are baked out and built in these different lighting scenarios, and it runs beautifully. Every game that you would play on a 360, a PlayStation 4, the 8th gen, I would say the 8th gen was like the golden era because like our engines targeted our hardware. And I will just say like we have this narrative that we're trying to do something new with UE5 and Unity 6 on these newer consoles, and the reality is we're pushing ray tracing because it gives you a higher fidelity lighting output, and we're pushing all of these UE5 techs like Lumen and Nanite, and the trade-off here is you have smeared mud crawling across your screen because you got to downsample everything just to be able to run these techs. Like you got to run the game at an internal resolution of 480p or 720p and then smear it across your screen and then TAA it to death or run it through an AI upsampling algorithm. And I'm not for it. And this generation, like people who aren't even technical, that are just gamers, aren't for it.
Their enemies, those things do not integrate naturally within those scenes. So that famous scene at the end of Uncharted, there's really nothing in there except for your character model walking around. And so as a result, they don't have to worry about that. Which, of course, that opens another can of worms in terms of scoping your project based on what you're trying to do artistically, right? And all throughout history, there have been games that have attempted to push technology in one way or the other, and maybe they don't get the balance right. And they create something using technology that maybe they didn't need in the first place, right? That's a whole separate other thing. That's a problem. So
I would wrap it up as like this whole generation is a problem. Like all of these games pushing for this tech, for this higher fidelity rendering, they're like, this is better, this is dynamic, this is higher fidelity, this is going to get us closer to realism. Maybe that's not the goal of gaming. Maybe the goal of gaming is an art direction, stylized art, and reminding you that you're having fun. Red Dead Redemption 2 came out before all of this nonsense, and guess what? It ran perfectly fine across every console. It's a last-gen game. Just don't feed into this rhetoric that you're being fed. Like, it's all BS.
Part of the problem, though, with that sort of target, moving those things to real time is great. It also facilitates easier development for things like lighting artists and building these environments. But, of course, with ray tracing and all that, it has a computational cost, which we're seeing. And this has never not been a problem on consoles, and it's still a problem on consoles, in that in order to achieve this, you have to make sacrifices. In the past, that would be things like frame rate, and just like raw, resolution and such. But obviously, there has been a resurgence in not resurgence. There has been an upswell in this use of reconstruction, temporal anti-aliasing, things designed to sort of minimize pixel popping and improve the overall stability of an image. But in this pursuit of performance using these demanding techniques, I would say a lot of developers do go a little bit too hard on it. And one perspective that
This is another thing. Developers don't go too hard on it. The engine itself goes too hard on it by default. Developers are then have to rein it back and study and play through the scene and see what the impact of TAA or TSR is going to be, at least from Unreal Engine standpoint. If you're using a technology like XeSS, DLSS, or FSR, you're implementing that into an engine usually. And then they have beautiful documentation of like what you need to do to get that technology working within whatever the engine of your choice as a studio is. The problem is that all of these technologies work for different devices. Sony has its own implementation of Pisser, plus it can run certain FSR versions because they're AMD chipsets. But that's a whole different story altogether. The problem is that we're even in that place to begin with. That we're downsampling games, in some cases down to like 640p, and then stretching it across 4K monitors. That's the problem to begin with, that we're even at that place. The reality is Quake 2 ran at a higher native resolution in OpenGL before the era of the like DirectX on a Carmack, on a John Carmack developed title. It ran at a higher resolution at a higher frame rate than these modern titles are running. And everyone's going to ask why Quake 2 Remastered looks beautiful, the edge clarity, the sharpness, the in motion, compared to one of these modern, Unreal Engine 5 titles. That's why. It's a night and day difference.
It means image quality then suffers, right? That is the big thing. This image instability. People are picking up on it, and they're not wrong. The rise of these techniques, things like denoising not being great.
And again, I have nothing against these guys, and I do like that. Like when it comes to the tech itself, he if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, he calls it a duck. So I have mad love for the dude for speaking his mind on this. It's garbage. He's right. No one's wrong about this. The eyes don't lie. You don't have to be a technical person to be able to look at something and say this stuff looks worse than what it used to. It is simply the truth. And if your customer, if your audience who is not technically sound can play these things, look at them and go, I don't like this, then you need to examine your priorities as an industry and as game engine developers, graphic engineers for these major game engines. You need to re-examine your priorities. You need to pull in the board, talk to the CEO and CFO and say, hey, they're not buying this shit, excuse my language, anymore, and we need to do something about it.
In Unreal Engine 5 especially, with like their default denoiser, you have the temporal anti-aliasing issues, you have the upsampling issues. All of these things by themselves can be solved with more input data, but because they're being pushed to this limit, everything kind of gets noisy, right? And this also varies depending on the type of screen you're using. Like on PC, I've had arguments over DLSS before where they're like, I don't like it, it's smeary, it's noisy. And I'm talking from the perspective of being lucky enough to use a native 4K screen. They're using a 1080p screen.
And the funny thing is that like I remember having conversations with fellow developers back whenever all of this technology was introduced, and everybody was like, we'll never be here. Oh, the next gen's not going to be reliant on upsamplers. DLSS is just a tool to be able to allow you to run games you wouldn't be able to run before. They're not going to actually make that a requirement for the games that are being developed. Would they? I remember it. It was all over Reddit. It was everywhere. And the funny thing is we're having the same conversations right now about frame generation. And if we continue down this road, I mean, all I can say is if you're looking at the market and you're looking at all the layoffs and you're looking at all these studios shutting down and you're looking at the state of the industry and you haven't put one and one or two and two together to make four, they're blowing their foot off. Like it's simple math, people. Come on, get your stuff together. Like what is that show? He's like, get all your stuff, put it in a bag, get it together. It's Rick and Morty. Like, we need to get it. We know where we are. We realized this is the wrong path, and we need the course correct.
That matters a lot in terms of what the base input resolution is going to be, and it really does impact image quality. So there's that. The other point I would say about visuals as a whole is that this takes people to make. This stuff is generated by real humans. We've reached a point where fidelity...
I don't like it. I agree with him here, right? We need tools that are going to speed up the development process. But again, I think we flew too close to the sun. Instead of focusing on tools that allowed our lives to be easier, like we completely skipped over GPU light mass. Completely skipped over it. Ray tracing is amazing and everything, but like we don't have to be making, like we don't have to just forego baking lights. We didn't have to like jump right into the ray tracing bandwagon. GPU light mass is a thing. Optimization comes at play. Studios' choices do come into play here. I don't want to downplay that. I don't want to say that studios don't have a choice. They do. You don't have to go with UE5. You don't have to drink the Nanite and Lumen Kool-Aid. You don't have to go with ray tracing for everything you're developing. But the reality is that all of these time factors that they keep talking about, like if we do this, we can save time. That's what the board of directors at these companies hear, and they're gonna shove Epic's rhetoric down the studio's throat and down the developer's throat, and they're gonna be like, "Go do this because they said it's possible," without really understanding from an engineering standpoint, is it really possible? And unfortunately, sometimes once you've gotten 6 months to a year into something, it becomes more expensive to pivot. And when you're already at the limitation of what your budget allocation was, the last thing that anyone wants to hear is we have to change course. And that's where we are. Like, that is exactly where we are.
Quality is so high in games and has been for so long that just creating these assets is extremely expensive.
And that's another BS. People are going to tell you, like, back to back, oh, well, if we move to Lumen, somehow or another, magically, we don't have to optimize assets, which is a load of BS. I did another video on this. Fortnite. Fortnite's a really good example of a game that uses Lumen and Nanite. And everybody just forgets that Fortnite has fallback LODs and HLODs. Like, you don't have to enable Lumen. It runs a game. It has fallback triangles. It has HLOD fallback because it ran on DirectX 11. It ran in Unreal Engine 4 before any of these technologies existed. You're not just going to magically pop up and be like, yeah, we can just use Lumen and Nanite and not have to worry about triangle count at all. That doesn't happen. That's not reality. And then if you do want to use Nanite, go ask Epic and those developers who enabled Nanite on all these meshes how long it took them to make all of their meshes Nanite ready. Go ask them. You can't use mass materials. You can't use the same tricks that you can use on a standard rasterization pipeline. They had to go physically model hundreds, if not thousands, of assets over again to simply enable the Nanite checkbox. So this notion that somehow or another this is saving studios time, no, it didn't. That was added time and added budget and added cost for those guys to go do that.
Time consuming. And not all artists are the same in terms of their skill set as well. So I saw somebody complaining that something like Avowed didn't look as good as Uncharted 4 or Red Dead Redemption 2.
Every single thing here, every single thing on these characters are casting shadows. And the person that said these later games don't look as good as these games, they're right. These later games aren't running at the same native resolution as this game. You're getting a higher native quality image out of these older games than you are on any modern day game. It is what it is. A pixel is a pixel. I don't care how many filters or sharpening passes you throw it to, or how many AI upsamplers you run on something. If you take a 1080p image natively and you just stretch it using a monitor's upscaler, because all of these LCD monitors, OLED monitors have them. If you feed it a native, 720p image, it's going to upscale to 1080p. It's just going to stretch it. But you feed that into like an upscaler, and then that upscaler feeds it to your monitor. You're going to end up with all this artifacting.
And they were really incensed about that. Like, how can this be a downgrade? This is a new generation. But that bumps up against this whole issue with manpower and like what
So none of that was dynamic, I guess.
people can realistically achieve, and budgets and all these other things. So it's not even the technology anymore that's impacting the visual presentation, right? You can't look at one of the most revered development studios in the world with infinite resources like Rockstar. They were able to pour everything they had into making Red Dead Redemption 2. Most studios could never dream of having that talent of people, that pool of talent, that sort of budget, that amount of time to make these games. And that's what was necessary to get there. So, something like Avowed has to leverage new technologies like, Lumen, Nanite, and what that, to sort of push its graphics game up a bit while still having constraints in other areas. So I think it's just a whole mix of these all issues coalescing together, and the fact that diminishing returns is, I would say, kind of real to a point. And that also ties in again back to the whole real-time versus baked kind of stuff that we've been able to achieve great looking visuals for so long. So, and then lastly, everybody has a different eye for things. Like what my eye focuses on, what Alex, what you see in a...
I think this is a load of BS. Whenever you have an uprising, or should I say pushback in the industry so hard about the graphical fidelity of the 9th gen, nobody has different eyes. Everybody's looking at this with the same eyes. It looks like crap. And everybody's saying it looks like crap. And they're tired of that. Like, they can't explain it to you technically because they're just gamers. They're playing games and they're going, these games look worse than these games. That's exactly what they're telling. They're not beating around the bush. They're not spinning it into their own, this is the reason why, or even trying to explain it to you. They say modern day graphics don't look as good to me. And my 13-year-old child son can tell me the same thing. He likes playing on his PS4 more than he likes playing on PS5 because to him the graphics look better. Like, he's told me that. He's not technical, he's just a gamer. And that's the reality of things right now. Nobody has different eyes looking for different things. TAA smearing is bad, but it existed last generation. That isn't something that just popped up in the 9th gen. It's just that we only had TAA smearing across native 1080p images, or in some cases 4K, because previous generation consoles did try to approach 4K without upscaling, without DLSS and FSR and PISR and XESS, and it wasn't a thing. So that's the difference. And the other thing is, pay attention to the technologies that they keep mentioning over and over again, and ask yourself, what engine are they talking about? They're not going to directly say the engine, but all of the features that they keep mentioning, ask yourself.
Scene and what you appreciate can be totally different to what somebody else sees. Like the things that annoy us might not annoy another person, right? Like you have little frame inconsistencies, like little frame time spikes. There's a lot of people that do not care. They don't notice it. That's where the whole runs fine on my PC thing comes from, right? But they might really, really dislike the way smearing looks from, temporal anti-aliasing and reconstruction, especially when used on a lower res monitor. And that's all they can see when they look at that screen. The rest of it doesn't matter. They see that smearing. That's what they're laser focused on. They don't like it. And they're not wrong either. Like, that's absolutely their prerogative to do it. So I think all of this stuff together has created this whole situation where, yeah, there's a subset of people that think games.
A subset, the majority of people, including my teenage kids. It's not a subset. Everyone that I know is going back to playing older games or playing remastered games or non-upscaled games. And most of the modern games that have come out in 9th gen they just have that smear. They have that look. They have that feel. And everyone who has played them is like, wait, something's up here. They're not talking about older games. They're talking about the ones that have been made this recently. It's not a subset. It's the majority of people, and it's specifically games that are made in a quote unquote general purpose engine that is tailored towards AAA studios.
Can look worse or haven't really evolved, even though technically they have. And I think it's just going to continue to get quote unquote worse given how all of this works together. I don't know. Was that coherent enough?
I think it's such a holistic issue, and you gave a whole bunch of different points about it as to why it is the way it is, and I think that covers almost every single basis. I would only add 2 things. You covered everything that I would have said. I would have added only that since this is about YouTube videos, that there's an angle to this about making profit online.
Now this guy's gonna talk about like, come on, Digital Foundry. Like, you guys are great. I respect y'all to death. But, and I'm not going to say that what he's about to say isn't true. He's basically going to say that, there's money or there's profit in griefers. A lot of these people that are making, that are saying these things, they're not making YouTube videos. They're saying it on Reddit or they're saying it in console. Like, if you go look at Steam right now, you go look at any Unreal Engine 5 Steam community post right now, they're not making a profit by talking trash about how these games perform or how they look in motion. This isn't profit motivated. Even for my channel, I'm not monetizing my channel to the regard that these guys are talking about here. And I would argue that most gamers feel the same way. They're not jumping on some negative bandwagon to try to overblow something. Gamers are upset. And for someone who's been developing an Unreal Engine for a really long time, I love the engine. I will say that the 5.5 is in a better place than it's ever been before. But that's not saying much because Unreal Engine 4.27 is still Unreal Engine 4 is still my favorite. Because for me, I'm able to target platforms, run on the Steam Deck, develop for Nintendo Switch. I'm able to hit consoles, modern 8th gen, both of them, a lot easier than I am following UE5's current optimization course. Let's put it like that. UE5 is not bad. It's just, man, we're only at 5.5. It's a tip of the iceberg inside of its development cycle, and people didn't even jump from Unreal Engine 3 to UE4 until after 4. I would say 16, 4. People weren't making the jump until 4.7 at least. It's just the way things go with these development cycles on these engines. Stability is a thing, and feature sets are a thing, and optimization tools are a thing. If anyone's interested, Tom Lumen just went over optimizing Quixel assets, and you could see he ran into some pain points, and it was in the brand new 5.5 version. He ran into a couple of pain points along the way where the tooling wasn't behaving the way that he expected while he was stepping through how to optimize them. But that's where we are. Honestly, we're in the middle of a transition. We're in the middle of an engine transition, and we're targeting like hardware that honestly is underpowered for the newer engine versions. It is what it is. If it walks and talks and quacks like a duck, it's a duck.
And being really negative and drama stirring is a huge profit angle. The grift is real. And so people want to make money. And so you'll see a lot of negative videos, even about topics that you would be surprised that there's a negative video about it. It's just a really good way to get people to talk and look at your video. But the second thing I would add to is just game stylization has changed over time.
Yeah, I agree with that too.
Like the type of games, we talked about this back when there was this uproar about Far Cry 5 looking worse than Far Cry 2 or whatever. And, you know, games went from being very dynamic, real-time lighting, simulation heavy to being, as in what was the AAA trend, to being very much so about like focused narrative experiences.
See, he just contradicted the entire beginning of the video in one sentence. Games went from being ultra dynamic, simulation heavy, like, okay, like he just literally said we've come from that place. We've been there before. What was it, Guerrilla Games that made Red Faction? That like you could destroy entire buildings, and that stuff ran on like, man, I want to say PlayStation 2. You know, don't call me out on that. It might have been PS3, but I want to say Red Faction was like dynamic with destructible buildings on PS2, but maybe it was PS3. But yeah, he just contradicted all of that. Like, we've had these survival-based dynamic base building games where you could like with full-blown day-night cycles for a long time now. The trend of the industry is that they're trying to approach the quality or the fidelity with dynamic lighting that they have with static lighting, and in order to do that you need ray tracing, because you need your lighting data to be more than just CSM, more than just shadow maps, more than just some texture maps. You need like the global illumination you could only obtain through some computational heavy type cost. And for better or for worse, Lumen is what we got in Unreal Engine. But if you go look at Ubisoft and if you go run Avatar, they handle this a lot differently, and performance, you get a lot you get a much different performance fall off in their engine than you do in Unreal Engine 5.
Is that were more akin to Hollywood movies in a lot of ways, and like linear corridors. And there's this tension, because if you want to have ultra baked lighting like an Uncharted 4's end scene there, well then the entire scene can't be moving, right? So but what if a dev wants things to be moving because it's more their prerogative for their game design? Well, then they have to lean into other technologies and visuals that make that possible. And as a result of this tension, sometimes when people think things look worse, they're actually talking about entirely different game designs. And I don't think those comparisons should be made apple to apple. They're apple to orange at that point. And it's always good to have context in mind as to what type of game we're talking about before we start comparing, I don't know, Red Dead Redemption 2 versus something else, right?
Now, I agree with him, but I think that they're missing the point. This isn't that people are taking games and doing a game comparison. They come to you and they say this generation of games looks worse than last generation of games. And then the question is usually asked, like, what do you mean? Can you give me an example? And then they give you an example that comes to mind for them. They're telling you in a blanket statement, the same way that my sons told me, current generation games look like garbage. And he developed that opinion from playing them and seeing them in motion versus playing PS4 games and older, 4+ rendered games, Unreal Engine 3 games, Unreal Engine 4 games, Unity 5 games. He's playing these older games and then he's playing newer games, and he's literally telling me 8th-gen games look better than 9th-gen. It's a blanket statement. It's the same thing that you guys are hearing. They're not doing game-to-game comparisons until you're like, give me an example, and then they explain a game. And then you try to like wrap it up into like, oh, well, that's a dynamic game and this one's a static game and that one's this and this one's that. Like, no, no one cares about the reason. No one's trying to get all super technical about it. At the end of the day, you got to ask yourself if the juice justified the squeeze. If the cost is that every game's going to run like crap because we wanted to be able to get closer to the visual fidelity that we had last gen, but we wanted to do it in real time. If that's the cost, then was the juice worth the squeeze? I would argue that, just like everyone else is saying, we probably moved in the wrong direction.
And that was a really great point of yours about budget and Avowed.
Also,
really
Alex, I would say on top of that, people are asking for more interactivity in games, more simulation. We certainly are. This is key to.
And I'll also state here that they keep making the argument about development time and studio time and cost being the primary reasons why they went down this rabbit hole to begin with. Look at the current state of the industry and ask yourself, did it help? Did it help? Did it get them what they were after? I would say that, like, if that was the goal, all you really did was tick off a bunch of gamers, have a bunch of gamers and a bunch of people who don't even know tech look at the current industry and go, well, current gen games look like garbage compared to last gen games. Everybody's sticking with their previous gen console, or they're sticking with indie titles. They haven't made the leap into the AAA. No one's jumping on the video card bandwagon here. Studios are laying off. Did it work? Did their goal actually reduce development time, reduce dev costs, and actually work? Because the last time I checked, the industry's in a horrific state, and my friends, colleagues, and people that have been in this industry for 10 plus years are looking for jobs. So it's rhetoric, it's hogwash, and it's a way to try to like explain things off. Now, I will say that this fella here on the screen says that, we're in an impasse. We're at a place where engines are having identity crisis. And just like the other guy said, like Hollywood studios, he nailed it right there. The engines are more focused on real-time virtual film production right now than they are on games. That's the truth. UE5 jumped into the bandwagon with all of their high-end, ultra fidelity, all of these technologies that they're talking about, megalights that are supposed to be ready for games. Consoles and PCs aren't ready for this in real time. All of these technologies that are being funneled into this engine on the backs of Fortnite money has been put there for the small film industry, the Legos, the Disneys, and like look at the licensing model change. I've talked about this before. This engine, which is just so happens to still do games because it started its life as a game engine, has been more tailored towards Hollywood and going after that Disney money at the birth of UE5 than any other version of Unreal Engine before it. Like, it's being used for the Weather Channel. It's being used for ArcViz projects. They don't have to worry about 60 frames per second or 90 frames per second. They render out the sequencer at 30 frames, 29 frames per second. And then guess what? It doesn't matter how much ray tracing they toss into the scene or how expensive their materials are, how many draws they have. At the end of the day, we as gamers are just feeling it,
Getting there. Right? It went away for a reason, and it's because of this rise of all this advanced baked lighting, physically based materials. Everybody trying to make these things look super realistic and good, and they got there. But I think something like the Order 1886 was one of the first to really do it. It's a perfect example of those limitations. It looks insanely good even today, but it is like extremely static. Everything is locked in, and game design actually followed this trend by and large for many, many years. And we've not gotten back to the simulation heavy stuff that we'd like to see, but all this real-time rendering, this is key to getting there. Without it, you're stuck.
And see, this is where I would have to respectfully disagree with him. I love the guy to death. I love their channel to death, but we're not stuck. You don't need ray tracing to do dynamic scenes. We've done that with shadow maps. You could do virtual shadow maps even in UE5. You don't have to have lumen and global illumination. Fortnite was fully dynamic on UE4. the forest is fully dynamic. You build things. You have a full-blown day-night cycle. I would just argue that he's simply wrong here. Now, if you want the visual fidelity that you get out of some of these baked lighting scenes in a fully dynamic scene, if you want to approach that, then yeah, he's being truthful there. But we don't need it. We don't need to fly that close to the sun. No one's upset about the state that things were in the 8th gen. They just wanted things to run faster and be better with that technology. They're telling you we're unhappy with downsampling my game to 640p and then upscaling it to 4K just so I can have lumen and ray tracing, like our nanite. Like, none of that technology matters to people. Like, they're telling you the answer. Go back to regular G-buffer deferred rendering with really good AA. We could pretty much pay for MSAA on top of a 1080p image and have better quality at 4K than this garbage we're doing right now. You do know that. With the added overhead, we could have gone back to last gen, 8th gen, UE4, slapped MSAA, which is by arguably the best AA technology ever made, slap it on a deferred rendering pipeline and keep it 480p, and guess what? No aliasing, ever. You could have super sampled everything rendered in deferred rendering to hit 4K quality and kept everything the same. Nothing about the engine needed to change. Just push it on to current gen hardware and boom, you have all that extra overhead for getting a larger resolution. We didn't have to go the way we went. That's the truth. And that's coming from someone who's worked in this industry for freaking 2 decades. So I just have to respectfully disagree with some of these statements. What do you guys think? Let me know down in the comments. I want to say thank you to everybody who is part of the Wild Ox Studios family, who is a part of the, Wild Ox Studios Discord. For those of you who have been a part of the Wild Ox Studios Unreal Engine tutorial series, give me a shout. Let me know what you'd like to see next. Until next time, happy developing and toodles, guys.